Now my pleasure to introduce for opening remarks and the first presentation, Jennifer Forde. Jennifer Forde is a regulatory counsel in the Office of Regulatory Policy in CDER. Jennifer has experience supporting the development of policies and procedures related to the regulation of human drugs, including the development of new regulations and policies under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Forde.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Forde, Regulatory Counsel at CDER's Office of Regulatory Policy. I would like to personally welcome everyone to this SBIA webinar on reporting drug amount under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act. The data received by FDA under the Drug Amount Reporting Program are important because they provide the agency with a more comprehensive picture of the drug supply chain. This more comprehensive picture of the drug supply chain helps to inform our operational decision-making in furtherance of our mission to protect and promote the public health. This includes our operational decision-making around inspection planning and mitigating supply chain disruptions. In carrying out the Drug Amount Reporting Program, we have been reviewing public comments submitted to the dockets for the associated draft regulatory guidance and technical conformance guide documents. We appreciate the comments received, and we are taking them into consideration in conjunction with further implementation of the Drug Amount Reporting Program. We note that comments can be submitted to a guidance at any time, and the docket numbers for the Drug Amount Reporting guidances are on this slide and can be accessed via www.regulations.gov. Since the fall of 2021, we've also been receiving drug amount data in the NextGen portal from registrants of listed drugs. We've been reviewing the data received for calendar years 2020 and 2021, and we are taking them into account in determining future refinements to the Drug Amount Reporting Program process. Furthermore, we have received inquiries regarding the drug amount reporting process at our mailbox, drugamountreporting@fda.hhs.gov, which has helped inform our thinking on the current state of drug amount reporting and has helped to generate ideas on how to improve the program for the future. Again, we appreciate the questions and comments received on the program thus far and look forward to working with registrants of listed drugs on the program going forward. For today, we have the pleasure of hearing from a range of speakers, both from FDA and non-FDA speakers, on topics pertaining to drug amount reporting. These topics include, but aren't limited to, the regulatory background of drug amount reporting, related registration and listing drug requirements, the purpose and basic framework of drug amount reporting, and examples of drug amount reporting. These sessions will also include question and answer sessions, and we look forward to the audience participation. For detailed information on today's topics, please see the agenda for this conference. All right, and now on to drug amount reporting regulatory background. On March 27, 2020, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, i.e. the CARES Act, was enacted. The CARES Act includes authorities intended to improve FDA's visibility into drug supply chains. Section 3112E of the CARES Act added new Section 510J3 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, i.e. FD&C Act, which requires that each person, including repackers and relabelers, who registers with FDA under Section 510 of the FD&C Act with regard to a drug must report to FDA annually on the amount of each listed drug that was manufactured, prepared, propagated, compounded, or processed by such person for commercial distribution. We will now review each of the elements of this slide on the subsequent slides. So obligations under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act pertain to registrants of listed drugs. In this slide, we can discuss who is a registrant. An establishment engaged in the manufacture of a drug in the U.S., including contract manufacturers, is required to be registered with the FDA. Likewise, any establishment within a foreign country engaged in the manufacture of a drug, including contract manufacturers, that is imported or offered for import into the U.S. is also required to be registered with the FDA. Each registrant must provide certain information for each listed drug it manufactures for commercial distribution, including unfinished drugs and APIs. These obligations pertain to the registrant, e.g., manufacturer, including contract manufacturers. Unless the applicant is also the registrant, these obligations do not pertain to an applicant of an approved drug. With respect to drug amount reports submitted under the CARES Act, while contract manufacturer registrants are included in the scope of registrants for which a drug amount report is required, note that an applicant, e.g. holder of a drug application that has been authorized as an agent on behalf of a contract manufacturer, may submit the drug amount report. And for more information on this, please see question and answer D in the draft guidance, reporting amount of listed drugs and biological products under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act. Also note that Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act does not apply only to the last registrant in the drug supply chain, e.g., registrants that release a package form suitable for distribution to pharmacies, hospitals, or other dispensers or sellers of the drug product to patients or consumers. Data reported from registrants along the supply chain on the amount of listed drugs and biological products that they manufacture, including data from registrants that manufacture a drug before it is in final package form, provide FDA with a more comprehensive picture of the drug supply chain to improve operational decisions. For this reason, data reported from different registrants along the supply chain for a particular drug are not considered duplicative. Obligations under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act pertain to listed drugs. In this slide, we can discuss what is a listed drug. So, drug registrants are required to list each drug manufactured at their establishments intended for commercial distribution. Listed drugs can include finished dosage form products, API, and other types of listed drugs, e.g., drug that consists of API with other ingredients and that is not a finished dosage form product. Drugs not required to be listed are not required to be included in a Section 510J3 report. Obligations under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act pertain to listed drugs that are manufactured, prepared, propagated, compounded, or processed for commercial distribution. Manufacture, preparation, propagation, compounding, or processing also includes repacking and relabeling. Note that FDA does not intend to take action if registrants whose only business operation in the drug listing file is sterilize, analysis, particle size reduction, and or salvage do not submit reports under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act. FD believes the data reported by other registrants, e.g., registrants with business operations of manufacture, repack, or relabel in the drug listing file will be sufficient. Again, obligations under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act pertain to listed drugs that are manufactured, prepared, propagated, compounded, or processed for commercial distribution. Commercial distribution means any distribution of a human drug except for investigational use under Part 312, and any distribution of an animal drug or an animal feed bearing or containing an animal drug, except for investigational use under Part 511. The term does not include internal or interplant transfer between registered establishments under common ownership and control, including a parent, subsidiary, or affiliate company. For foreign establishments that manufacture, repack, relabel, or salvage, or for foreign private label distributors, the term commercial distribution has the same meaning, except the term does not include distribution of any drug that is neither imported nor offered for import into the U.S. The determination of commercial distribution also does not rely on whether the registrant is manufacturing a drug that is in final package form. Registrants of a listed drug, including but not limited to API and contract manufacturers that is not in final package form, can also be considered to manufacture a drug for commercial distribution, even if the registrant is not the last registrant in the drug supply chain. Okay, reports on the amount of each registrant's listed drugs must be submitted annually. Such reports should include information regarding the amount of drug released for the respective calendar year. So that's January 1 through December 31st. It's recommended that reports for calendar year 2020 should be submitted no later than February 15, 2022, and reports for calendar year 2021 should be submitted no later than May 16, 2022. Registrants that have yet to submit their data are encouraged to do so. Reports for subsequent calendar years should be submitted no later than February 15th of the following calendar year. FDA is considering comments to our draft guidance on reporting amount of listed drugs and biological products under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act, including comments about the recommended timeframes for submitting the required reports. The draft guidance document is not a binding document, and its recommended reporting dates, including the February 15th, 2022 and May 16th, 2022 dates for reporting 2020 and 2021 data, respectively, are not required deadlines for submitting such data. However, registrants are still required under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act to report annually regarding the amount of listed drugs that are manufactured, prepared, propagated, compounded, or processed for commercial distribution. We are carefully reviewing all issues raised by stakeholder comments to the docket, including regarding the recommended reporting timeframes. We will consider updating the draft guidance's recommended timeframes for reporting as appropriate, along with other issues raised by such stakeholder feedback. All right, so here we have our resources slide. There is a list of resources here, but I really would like to highlight the first link, which goes to FDA's CARES Act implementation activities. This first link on CARES Act implementation includes a well-organized list of resources focused on the drug amount reporting program. I would really suggest going there to find and access guidances and technical guides, including guides to assist in drug amount data submissions to FDA's electronic portal. So, in summary, obligations under Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act pertain to registrants of listed drugs. If you are required to register your establishment and list your drug, then you're going to want to review the Drug Amount Reporting Program materials. A key resource, again, is the CARES Act implementation website that was referenced on the prior slide. And again, reports on the amount of each registrant's listed drugs must be submitted annually. So we are happy to answer your questions during the Q&A panel. Questions regarding the content of drug amount reports can also be submitted to drugamountreporting@fda.hhs.gov. And with that, I will turn it over to Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary, the CDER Office of Compliance's lead consumer safety officer, to discuss FDA's registration and listing requirements. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentation. Our first presenter, Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary, will provide an overview of registration and listing requirements that pertain to drug amount reporting program. Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary is the team lead on the Data Quality and Compliance team, which monitors registration and listing data compliance. She started her FDA career with the Drug Registration and Listing Service in 2008 and later helped create the DRLS compliance program in 2015. Her main professional focuses are data integrity, compliance, and NDC. Our second presenter, Matthew Rosenberg, will provide a review of FDA's use of data submitted under the Drug Amount Reporting Program. He's an economist with the Office of Strategic Programs within CDER. In this role, he advises leadership and leads quantitative analysis using techniques from data science and economic modeling to measure the external impacts of CDER policies in areas such as drug shortages, drug pricing, and opioids. Our third presenter in this segment is Jennifer Hyland, who's an operations research analyst in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality in CDER. Currently, she supports efforts to monitor the state of quality for all regulated sites and products. Please join me in welcoming Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. In this presentation, I will be briefly talking about the regulatory background and requirements for registration and listing. A question that comes to mind might be, why are we speaking about establishment registration and drug listing in this webinar? And the answer is that the drug amount reporting requirements under the CARES Act apply to registrants that are also required to list drugs with FDA. Let's start with a poll question. Choosing options A, B, or C, please tell us how familiar you are with registration and listing requirements and process. A, you are an expert. B, you are somewhat familiar, but you're not necessarily an expert. And C, you have no idea what establishment registration and drug listing actually is. So let's give it 10 seconds and look at the answers. All right. For those of you who answered A, congratulations, you just won a 10-minute break. You can go grab another cup of coffee. For groups B and C, we will continue with the presentation. Manufacturers that engage in any step of the drug manufacturing process are required to register their facilities with FDA and provide a list of all drugs they manufacture for U.S. commercial distribution. These requirements are spelled out in Section 510 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and Part 207 of Title 21 of Code of Federal Regulations. Each drug must be listed using a National Drug Code or the NDC, and that requirement was first introduced in Drug Listing Act of 1972. I have included some legal definitions here, and we are not going to go through each and every one of them in detail since you can refer to them later, but I wanted to point out that drug manufacturing activities include activities such as packaging, contract packaging, labs that do analysis under contract, labeling, and etc. It also includes repackaging and relabeling and salvaging drugs. It covers both domestic and foreign manufacturing facilities. Registrant is the entity that owns or operates those manufacturing establishments. A registrant can be a manufacturing establishment, or in the case of common ownership, it can be a corporate office that submits registration information for all its manufacturing facilities. A private label distributor does not engage in any drug manufacturing activity, but the drug is commercially distributed under its name and label. For the term commercial distribution, what you'll need to know is that it does not apply to investigational use under Part 312 and does not include interplant transfer of a drug between establishments under common ownership. However, for drugs that are imported, we always recommend that the drug is listed to facilitate the importation process. Now that we learned about who must register and list with FDA, we will briefly go through the drug listing requirements. Initial timing for listing submission is no later than 3 calendar days after initial registration. Obviously, that includes any drugs that are manufactured at the time of initial registration. Any updates to that list, including any new drugs manufactured for commercial distribution, any previously listed drug for which manufacturing has been ceased, or any update to the data submitted for a drug previously listed with FDA must be reported no later than June or December of the same calendar year. If there are no updates to the data previously submitted, then the registrant must certify that the drug listing files are up to date and the drug remains in the U.S. market as previously listed. The required drug listing data elements are included and discussed in 21 CFR Part 207-49. Drug listing requirements apply to all drugs in U.S. commercial distribution. That includes APIs and finished dosage forms and everything in between, which we call drugs for further processing. Human and animal drugs, over-the-counter and prescription drugs, biologics, and also drugs that are manufactured in the U.S. for export purposes only. Here we discuss the listing responsibilities and requirements for a drug manufactured by a contract manufacturing organization for a PLD. A PLD does not register with FDA because it does not engage in any drug manufacturing activity. The drug listing responsibility falls on the contract manufacturer of the drug, which is required to submit 2 drug listings, one under its own labeler code and another one under the PLD's labeler code. We keep talking about NDCs and labeler codes. It's worth mentioning that NDC, or National Drug Code, is the unique identifier assigned to all drugs in U.S. commercial distribution. Its three segments include the labeler code, which is assigned by FDA, product code, and package code that are proposed for assignment at the time of drug listing by companies. The product code identifies a unique product, including formulation and physical characteristic, and the package code identifies a unique package size and type. FDA recently proposed a change in the format and length of the NDC, and the proposed rule is available for commenting until end of November. NDC assignment can get a bit complicated when it comes to certain products. The first group we're going to discuss here would be co-packaged products. These products are listed as kits. They can be combination product or not. For example, a co-packaged product that includes a drug and a medical device would potentially be a combination product, and for the purpose of drug listing, it should be listed as a kit. In order for the product to be listed with Center for Drugs, it should have at least one drug part, and if it's a combination product, it should have a drug lead. For NDC assignments, the NDC assigned to the overall kit should be different than the NDC assigned to each drug part of the different, and the difference should be at the product code level because the products are different in this case. Any part that is not a drug should not be assigned an NDC. Those drug parts of the kit should be also listed individually if they are commercially distributed as a standalone product outside of the co-packaged or product or the kit. The other group would be drugs with multi-level packaging. For example, blister packs of a drug packaged in a carton or vials in a box. In this case, the NDCs assigned to different levels should be different at the package code level because the package size and type are different in this case. Any packaging level that is not available individually for commercial distribution should be reported only as the inner level in the drug listing file. I have included some resources here for you to provide information on registration and listing. But if you have any other questions, I'll be available to answer them through my personal email or the general mailbox edrls@fda.hhs.gov. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Matthew Rosenberg, and I'm an economist in the Office of Strategic Programs in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. In my presentation today, I'm going to provide an overview of how FDA plans to use the drug amount reporting data that you're submitting to support several important agency initiatives related to supply chain issues and drug shortages. Here's a quick overview of what I plan to discuss in my presentation. First, I'll describe FDA's overarching approach and vision for using the drug amount reporting data. Then, I'll highlight the ways in which these data enhance the agency's visibility into drug supply chains. And finally, I'll walk you through several FDA efforts that we expect to benefit from these data and how drug amount reports will support them. In general, we're planning to use the drug amount reporting data to enhance our understanding of drug supply chain issues and drug shortages. So how do we get there, at least conceptually, from drug amount reports submitted from individual establishments, like the one shown on this slide? In this example, we have a single report from a specific establishment that manufactures 3 separate NDCs. We can also look at reports across establishments and drugs, for instance, by finding other establishments that manufacture the same NDCs, as you can see in this example, or by identifying other NDCs made at the same establishment. And we can supplement the drug amount reports with other data that FDA routinely collects as part of its regulatory processes, such as drug registration and listing data, information submitted to FDA in regulatory documents and forms, and data purchased under contract, such as sales data from IQVIA or other vendors. When we bring all this information together, as I'll show in the rest of this presentation, we can begin to piece together an understanding of the structure of drug supply chains and their vulnerabilities. On the next few slides, I'm going to walk you through a hypothetical drug supply chain and describe how drug amount reporting data can help to sharpen FDA's visibility into the key dependencies. So consider a drug, and we start at the end of the supply chain with a specific product. And the way to think about this might be that this is a specific labeler's NDC that's eventually shipped to wholesale distributors. What we do is we work our way backwards through its production process. And the way to think about what I'm about to show you is that it captures something like the approved supply chain for an application product. So basically all establishments that may potentially be involved in production. For example, Product 1 has its finished dosage form, or FDF, manufactured at Establishment C. So when you see a number on the diagram, like Product 1, this refers, for instance, to different labelers, and a letter, like Establishment C, helps us distinguish different suppliers that might engage in the same production steps for the drug. Establishment C also purchases the active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API, from Establishment A, and also from Establishment B, which is an additional supplier of the same API. We also have a second product for this drug, perhaps another labeler's NDC, which is also manufactured at Establishment C, and an additional Establishment D, which also receives API from Establishment B. So what did FDA typically know about this supply chain prior to drug amount reporting? We had a sense of the eventual market share of these products in the United States using sales data. So in this hypothetical example, 30% of the volume might be for Product 1 and 70% for Product 2. We might have also known from prior compliance activity that Establishment D had a history of cGMP problems, such as from previous OAI inspections or similar challenges. And of course, from just looking at the supply chain structure, like you're seeing on this slide, which perhaps captures something like approved or registered establishments, we had a sense of which of the establishments may potentially have been involved in production. Although, of course, we didn't know how much of the production occurred at each of the establishments, or what the flows were between them, which are represented by the arrows on the diagram. So based on this information alone, what would we think are the key dependencies and vulnerabilities? Well, we might think that Establishment D is prone to production disruptions, and perhaps Establishments C and B are potential choke points because they have more than one arrow pointing downstream. Where the drug amount reporting data will help us is in establishing the typical or historical dependence of the supply chain on specific establishments, which will help us begin to assess which of the vulnerabilities, if they manifest, could be most impactful on the availability of the drug. So obviously Establishment C manufactures all of Product 1, and this is something we would have known anyway. But what we didn't know before is how much of Product 2 is manufactured at each of Establishments C and D. So in this example, 90% from C and 10% from D. For APIs, we won't be able to label the arrows because we don't have data on flows between establishments. But what we will know is what percentage of the API overall is made at each of the establishments. So in this example, 40% of the API is made at A, all of which is sent to C, and 60% is made at B, some of which might be sent to either C or D, but we don't know specifically how much. So now that I've discussed what information FDA will be able to glean from the drug amount reports, I wanted to take some time to highlight specific efforts that we think will benefit from drug amount reporting. One will be analysis of the extent of globalization in the U.S. drug supply chain, such as by studying how much of the manufacturing base is concentrated in specific parts of the world. Another will be enhancing our site selection model for developing risk-based inspection priorities, and we expect the data from drug amount reporting to help us refine our assessment of the patient exposure from each establishment. And also, we believe these data can help us respond to and potentially predict supply chain issues such as drug shortages, both by supporting our response to imminent supply chain disruptions and also by allowing us to anticipate vulnerabilities in drug supply chains that could lead to future issues. When it comes to analyzing the U.S. drug supply chain, much of FDA's previous work has been focused on the locations of establishments, which is the information that's been most readily available to us. On this slide, you can see some examples of analysis from the recent 100-day supply chain report. For instance, estimating that 52% of FDF establishments and 73% of API establishments were located outside of the United States in March 2021. But just because a certain proportion of establishments are located in these places, it doesn't mean that a similar proportion of products are being made there. And what we're hoping the drug amount data will help us assess is which products and how much of them are manufactured in these parts of the world. And that way we can better measure the extent to which the U.S. drug supply chain might be concentrated in certain places. On this slide, I'm going to provide a brief example of how drug amount reporting data can help support FDA's risk-based inspection priorities using the site selection model. So as you'll see here and also on the next few slides, one of the main ways we expect to benefit from the drug amount reporting data is by having better context around the public health importance of different parts of the drug supply chain. So consider a hypothetical establishment that potentially manufactures 3 products, 2 injectables, one that is higher risk for cGMP issues and the other that is medium risk, as well as a low risk oral product, perhaps something like a tablet or a capsule product. If we were to assess the patient exposure from this establishment just based on this information, we might think this is a somewhat risky establishment, since 2 of its 3 products have a moderate to high risk. Suppose that this establishment submits a drug amount report like the one on the right-hand side of the slide, in which 12 out of the 15 patient doses are manufactured for the oral product and just 3 out of the 15 are manufactured for the 2 injectables. Well, what we can clearly see is that there's lower patient exposure to higher risk products and higher patient exposure to low risk products, suggesting the establishment is less risky than we might have initially thought. We also expect these data to help FDA respond to drug shortages during emergencies. In these types of situations, such as natural disasters or public health crises, FDA can look at drug amount reporting data to assess the potential consequences of outages at specific establishments or in specific geographic areas, and to identify which products might be affected. Consider the hypothetical supply chain that I showed earlier, and suppose that establishment D were to cease production, for instance, due to the cGMP issues I described before. What might be the impact on the availability of this drug? We can see from the diagram that establishment D only manufactures product 2, and it's historically made 10% of it. So I just want to note quickly before I move past this part that what we're going to generally have a sense of through the reporting process is not necessarily real-time information on how much product is being made at an establishment at a specific point in time, but rather the historical information on how much is typically made there. But we really do believe that this type of information will still be helpful for us in understanding the potential impacts. So based on this information that we would have available to us, we might expect that something like 7% of the downstream market for this product could be affected. What if establishment C instead were to cease production, perhaps due to a major hurricane or other disaster? We can see that establishment C makes all of product 1. So based on this information, we would expect 30% of the market for sure to be affected. But it also makes 90% of product 2, or at least historically has made 90% of product 2, which means that up to an additional 63% of the market may also be affected if establishment D does not have the spare capacity to increase production. In this case, we can see that establishment C is especially critical to the production of this drug, which we would not have known without the drug amount reporting data. On the last few slides, I've walked you through how FDA plans to use the data to respond to imminent supply chain disruptions. Now I'm going to shift the focus a bit to how these data can help with measuring longer-term supply chain vulnerabilities and why that might be useful for attempting to predict supply chain issues such as drug shortages. So at FDA, we've been exploring how approaches from systems engineering, like reliability analysis, can help us synthesize a wide range of supply chain data into quantitative measures of supply chain vulnerability. So the key insight here is to begin thinking about drug supply chains like electric circuits, which in this case direct the flow of a drug and its inputs through several production steps and eventually out into the marketplace. Much like in the earlier diagrams, if we can begin to measure the characteristics of the nodes, the establishments in this case, and the edges, such as the connections or flows, we can start to calculate key measures of availability and the contributions of specific establishments to the overall production of the drug. So if you're interested in learning more about this work, we published a paper on this methodology in 2020, and I've included a link to it at the bottom of the slide. Ultimately, we see quantitative measures of supply chain vulnerabilities as a key input into our efforts to potentially predict future supply chain issues. In the diagram here, you can see a high-level conceptual framework for how this might work. We would start with a set of products that's potentially susceptible to the onset of supply chain issues. We would combine our measures of supply chain vulnerability with data on other risk factors, like market or product characteristics, and we would develop predictive models that can help us assess the probability of a supply chain issue over some horizon into the future. If successful, being able to predict supply chain issues several months or even longer into the future could give the agency more time to take actions to help prevent or mitigate these issues before they impact the marketplace and public health. And I want to highlight that when these supply chain issues reach the marketplace, they can really have major public health impacts. Some of you may have seen us share this case study at our 2018 public meeting on drug shortages, and for those who haven't, I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what we found through this work. So in 2011 to 2012, there was a shortage of norepinephrine, which is used to treat septic shock in hospitals. A study came out in 2017 in JAMA related to this shortage, and they estimated that in hospitals affected by the shortage, septic shock patients were switched to alternate treatments, and they saw a 3.7 percentage point increase in their death rate. So what does a 3.7 percentage point increase in the death rate mean for public health? When we projected this to all national septic shock hospital admissions, we estimated that this one shortage may have contributed to over 1,000 excess deaths and $13.7 billion in public health losses. So consider that this is one shortage, and we have more than 100 posted on our website right now. So I really believe that if we can make even a small dent in drug shortages or other supply chain issues, there's a potential to really improve the well-being of patients. To summarize, our plan at FDA is to use drug amount reporting data to sharpen our insights into drug supply chain issues such as drug shortages. The main insight that we expect to glean from the data is the extent to which drug supply chains depend on specific establishments. And what this will help us do is identify which supply chain vulnerabilities, if they manifest, could be the most impactful on the availability of drugs. And we also believe that these data can help to support several efforts at the agency, including risk-based inspection priorities through the site selection model and FDA's efforts to respond to and mitigate the public health impacts of supply chain issues. Thank you for your time this morning, and if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the chat for the upcoming Q&A session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hyland, and I am an Operations Research Analyst in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research in FDA. Today, I will talk about the basic framework for reporting. In this presentation, I will talk about who is required to report, what types of drugs should be reported, the report submission process, and data elements to be reported. First, who is required to report? The CARES Act requires registered establishments with listed drug and biological products to submit amount data for each drug on an annual basis. A registrant is a person who owns or operates the establishment where a drug is manufactured, prepared, propagated, compounded, or processed, and is not otherwise exempt from registration. The CARES Act requires registrants, including contract manufacturers, to report drug amounts. A registrant may authorize an agent to report data on their behalf. Each registrant should report amounts for all the listed drugs they manufacture. This includes drugs listed as export only. One of the key questions that we have received from many CARES Act drug amount submitters surrounds the issue of reporting for drugs listed by the NDCs, or National Drug Codes, of a contract manufacturer and a PLD, or private label distributor, so I will try to clarify the reporting process for both the manufacturer NDC and PLD NDC. The CARES Act requires reports to be submitted for each listed drug. With respect to drugs manufactured for commercial distribution by a PLD, FDA interprets to mean the amount manufactured, prepared, propagated, compounded, or processed by a manufacturer for commercial distribution by a PLD should be submitted under the NDC containing the contract manufacturer's labeler code and the NDC containing the PLD's labeler code. The CARES Act imposes the reporting requirement on registrants. Therefore, the contract manufacturer should submit this information for both NDCs. However, the contract manufacturer may authorize the PLD to submit the report or reports on the registrant's behalf. Amounts for both NDCs should be reported under the manufacturer's DUNS. To simplify reporting, FDA has limited the business operations for which amount data should be submitted to the following business operations: manufacture, API manufacture, repack, relabel, transfill, and positron emission tomography drug production. FDA does not intend to take enforcement action against certain categories of registrants if they do not report, such as salvagers and analytical testing lab establishments. What types of drugs should be reported? The CARES Act requires amounts to be reported for all listed drugs, including FDF, or finished dosage form products, APIs, or active pharmaceutical ingredients, and unfinished drug products. These drug types include prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs, homeopathic drugs, and medical gas products. FDA may issue an order to exempt certain biological products or categories thereof regulated under the Public Health Service Act from some or all of the reporting requirements if FDA determines that applying such reporting requirements is not necessary to protect the public health. For example, FDA is proposing an order to exempt blood and blood components for transfusion and also cell and gene therapy products where one lot treats a single patient from amount reporting. I will briefly discuss the report submission process in the next few slides. Please note that detailed instructions are provided in the User Reference Guide and the Technical Conformance Guide, which are available on the CARES Act website. First, submitters should create an account in the NextGen portal if they do not already have one. A single account can be used to submit data for any number of establishments. Multiple reports can be submitted for an establishment so a submitter does not need to submit all of an establishment's data all at once. The reference materials describe a limit to the number of rows that can be in a file, so establishments with many NDCs will need to make multiple submissions. Submit separate reports for each calendar year. In general, amounts should be reported for each listed NDC for each reporting year, even when the amount produced was 0. Report the number of packages by NDC by using the package type or types in the drug listing. Drugs to be reported can have single-level or multi-level packaging, and this affects some of the data elements included in the report. Reports can be submitted by manually entering data or by uploading data from a CSV file. Submitters can manually enter data in the portal interface by using prompts, drop-downs, and text boxes. Submitters will have two options for creating a CSV file to be uploaded. The first option is to use the CSV template file provided in the portal. The other option is for the submitter to create their own custom CSV file that follows the specifications provided on the website. Reports will be validated using certain data from FDA's Electronic Drug Registration and Listing System, also known as EDRLIS. The portal will check for invalid data and display an error message if it identifies data that does not match EDRLIS data. The message will suggest reviewing the file before proceeding to submit the data. The portal will also check for other types of errors, such as if a delimiter other than a comma is used. There are further details on these errors in the CSV instructions document on the website. Replacement reports can be submitted if an error is discovered in a previously submitted report. Currently, this process replaces all of the data that was in the previous report. Next, I will briefly go over data elements that will be included in the submission. Detailed descriptions for these elements can be found in the Technical Conformance Guide. The Establishment Identity element refers to the DUNS number used to identify the establishment for which the amount report is being submitted. The Establishment Business Operation element is the business operation performed for the drug being reported. As mentioned earlier, reportable business operations have been limited to manufacture, API manufacture, repack, relabel, transfill, and positron emission tomography drug production. Manufacture is the default selection. In most cases, a drug should be associated with only one business operation at a specific establishment. For example, if you manufacture both the API and the FDF of a drug at a single establishment and only list the drug under a single NDC for the FDF, you should not provide a report for the drug under both manufacturer and API manufacturer. Instead, you should provide a report under manufacturer. In some circumstances, it may be appropriate to provide a report for a listed drug under separate business operations at a single establishment. For example, if you are a repackager and a relabeler for a specific drug, and sometimes you repackage the drug, and sometimes you just relabel the drug, then you should provide reports under both the repack and relabel business operations and include the appropriate amounts with respect to each business operation. The National Drug Code, or NDC element, is a 10-digit identifier for the drug as listed with FDA. The source NDC element is used by repackers and relabelers to identify the source drug. The month element is used to report amount data for each month or for the annual total. It is recommended that monthly data be submitted. For manual entry, a submitter may enter only annual totals and leave monthly amounts blank. The reporting system requires a row for each month in CSV files, but the amounts are allowed to be blank or zero. In a CSV file, a submitter may enter non-zero monthly amounts and an annual total, or a submitter may enter zeros for each monthly amount and then provide an annual total. The next three elements pertain to the outermost packaging of a product. If a product has single-level packaging, then only the outermost packaging fields should be used. If a product has multi-level packaging, then use the outermost packaging fields to enter amounts for the highest level of packaging. The outermost package quantity released element refers to the quantity of drug released based on the drug's outermost packaging. The outermost package quantity distributed non-US element can be used if an establishment wants to take advantage of the CARES Act amount reporting policy related to the annual report of distribution data requirement of 21 CFR 314.81. Please refer to the draft guidance for details. The outermost package type element is for the number of packages of the outermost package type associated with the NDC for which you are submitting data. The next three elements pertain to the innermost packaging of a product. The innermost package directly encloses the drug. For a product with single-level packaging, a submitter should leave these elements blank when entering data manually or when submitting a CSV file. The innermost packaging fields are only for products with multi-level packaging. There is a presentation with reporting examples later on in this webinar. The innermost package quantity released element is the number of packages released that were the innermost package of a drug with multi-level packaging. The innermost package quantity distributed non-US element can be used if an establishment wants to take advantage of CARES Act amount reporting policy related to the annual report of distribution data requirement of 21 CFR 314.81. Please refer to the draft guidance for details. The innermost package type element is for the number of packages of the innermost package type associated with the NDC for a drug with multi-level packaging. The market unknown element is used only for foreign establishments. If a listed drug was manufactured in a foreign establishment for commercial distribution, but you do not know how much of the listed drug was imported or offered for import into the United States, then you will use this field to indicate that. The reporting system requires yes or no for CSV files. In summary, my presentation today covered the following topics. Registrants with listed products, including contract manufacturers, are required to report. Amounts for all listed drugs should be reported by NDC and business operations for each calendar year, and monthly reporting is recommended. Data can be submitted by using a CSV file or by entering data manually. I have also provided an overview of all the data elements used in submitting a CARES Act drug amount report. This concludes my presentation. I will respond to questions during the panel session. Thank you for listening.
Thanks everyone for the great presentations. If you haven't had a chance to submit your questions into the Q&A chat pod, please do so now. We'll answer as many questions as time allows. As a reminder, please indicate the presenter that the question is directed to by using the @ symbol and providing their name such as @Jennifer or @Leyla in the first part of your question. Looks like we have some questions coming in right now. The first group of questions looks like it'll be for Jennifer Forde. And here is the first question for Jennifer. Does the reporting include OTC products such as toothpaste that may be imported?
Thank you for that question. Drugs that are imported or offered for import would be subject to the reporting requirement, as well as OTC drugs. A note that Section 510J3 of the FD&C Act is not limited to application products. Listed drug products marketed in accordance with the requirements of Section 505G of the FD&C Act, often referred to as OTC monograph drugs, are to be reported, as well as OTC drugs that are application approved products. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to the next question that came in from Jennifer is the following. We wanted to confirm that this also includes OTC products that follow a final order or a monograph.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's similar to the one that we just received. And yes, the reporting for the drug amount program includes OTC products that follow a final order, final monograph. And just a note that on some of the information that the agency has had access to historically, we have had access to certain distribution data in annual reports for products approved under NDAs and ANDAs. The regulation for that is 21 CFR 314.81. However, those annual reports have been limited to application products and don't include OTC monograph drugs. So the CARES Act, as codified at 510J3 of the FD&C Act, really does provide us with an important source for information regarding the drug supply chain for OTC monograph drugs and can ultimately help inform our operational decision making. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got one more question for Jennifer Forde in this round, and here is the question. We are a distributor that works with a contract manufacturer. Do both parties have to complete the reporting?
All right, so distributors, if it's such as a private label distributor, entity that may not be required to register, then the reporting requirement does not apply to you. The reporting requirement goes to registrants of listed drugs. However, our guidance does recommend that data associated with human drugs should be organized and submitted separately by the NDC associated with the registrant's labeler code and the NDC associated with the private label distributor's labeler code. This can help facilitate our reconciliation of data with respect to drugs manufactured by a registrant for commercial distribution under the trade name or label of a private label distributor. And I'll additionally note that a private label distributor that has knowledge of the amount of drug that's been released, and if they've been authorized as an agent to submit a report on the registrant's behalf, can do so. And there's more information on that in the draft guidance under question and answer D. D as in David. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for responding to those questions. Moving on to our next panelist. We have a group of questions for Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary, and here is the first question. Can you explain NDC assignment for convenience packs?
Thank you, Ray, and thank you for the question. If you mean convenience kits or co-packaged products that are presented in the market as convenience kits, those are typically products that are co-packaged together in one packaging and include several articles, from which at least one is a drug article. In those cases, you are supposed to submit drug listing for the product with an NDC assigned to the overall kit, include all the parts in your drug listing, and then assign a different NDC product code to each drug part included in the co-packaged product or kit.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Leyla, and here is the question. Can you please define drug for further processing?
So drug for further processing typically is what is between an API and a finished dosage form. So for example, if you have a drum of tablets, which is further going into process of being packaged or labeled into the finished product, that drum is considered to be a drug for further processing. Anything that is not merely an API, but is also not completely available for marketing. In a different example, an API that is mixed with excipients also and is not converted into an actual dosage form just yet can also be considered a drugs for further processing.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Leyla, and here is the question. Please confirm that when you say manufacturer, you mean marketing authorization holder. CDMOs manufacture product, but are not typically license holders.
Yeah, we briefly talked about this. I think Jennifer did in her initial remarks. And usually the manufacturing, it can be a completely separate activity than sponsoring an application. So you can be the applicant holder and not be involved in any manufacturing activity whatsoever. And so the reporting responsibility, the drug listing responsibility, and therefore reporting responsibility falls on your manufacturers under the law, unless you are an authorized agent for the manufacturer. So yes, the applicant holder or the marketing authorization holder of the product is not always the manufacturing facility or manufacturer of the product.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, we have a few questions from Matthew Rosenberg, and here's the first question. The data submitted by industry would be from the past year. How would FDA use past data to interpret current situations, as these things change very quickly depending on various factors?
Yeah, hi Seth. Thank you for your question. And we're using the past data for two main purposes. The first is when there's an imminent supply disruption, like the example we saw in the presentation, we're planning to do scenario analysis. And the idea here is that we would use the historical information to give us a sense of the typical amount of production that occurs at a specific establishment for a product. So, of course, you know, this is information that isn't going to be in real time, and we recognize that. But what we're expecting is that it will help us get a potential sense of what some of the downstream impacts could be when these types of issues occur. And the second use is for this longer-term vulnerability and predictive modeling, which is going to be across a larger number of products. And in that instance, the historical data is going to allow us to connect the occurrence of past supply chain issues like drug shortages to changes or shifts in the supply chain or marketplace for those products. So as we collect more of the historical data, we're looking to identify some of these broader patterns that can help us to develop and to fit these kinds of models.
Thank you for responding to that question. Our tech people will be working with Matt just a little bit on backing off on the mic, but here's the next question while they're working on that technical issue. Does the lack of information on excipients, which can be critical to certain drugs and dosage forms, or may be very broadly used across many types of drugs, present a substantial limitation to the models that FDA is seeking to develop?
Yeah, so sorry everyone about the audio. Hopefully it's a little better right now. And I appreciate this question here. And I guess I would say, like any sort of modeling exercise, what we're doing is, our best attempt to approximate the real world. And we're never going to have full visibility into the supply chain, and we're certainly not going to see it to the extent that you are on a day-to-day basis. The key, though, from our perspective, is that our approach is flexible enough that it can expand to include more production steps in the supply chain as we have that information. So by combining across establishments and products, we're hoping to see the big picture of the different kinds of vulnerabilities in the supply chain and how, if they manifest, they could impact other sorts of steps or outcomes downstream.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question for Matt in this round, and here is the question. How does FDA plan to get started on operationalizing the vision that you've laid out for using the drug amount reporting data?
Yeah, so what I would say is that what we're doing right now is, we're obviously taking a look at the data that all of you have submitted in this initial round, and we're having our data scientists take a look at it to better understand what's been reported, the quality of the data, and to use this kind of information to inform, other sorts of changes we can make to the web portal or, clarifying instructions. So this is really the first step in that process. And as we move forward a bit more with this, we're eventually going to try to connect the data to our internal systems and to use them to inform the types of analysis that we saw in the presentation.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we have a few questions that have come in for Jennifer Hyland, and here is the first question. Can you submit a single CSV file for all of your products and different product strengths, or is a separate CSV file required for each?
Thank you for your question. You can submit all of your products in a single CSV file, although there is a limit to the number of rows, which is detailed in the guidance. I think it's about 10,000 rows. There have been some CSV files that were not processed, even though they were under 10,000 rows. So if the file is too large still, you can cut it in half and try again. Although make sure that for each NDC, the full 13 rows for that NDC is in a file. Thanks.
Thanks for responding to that question. We do have another question for Jennifer Hyland, and here is the question. For CSV file submission, are resources available to work with submitters to problem solve and resolve errors?
Yes, thank you. There are detailed documents on the website. You can check the CSV instructions file and the technical conformance guide. And if there are still issues, then you can email the drug amount reporting mailbox, and people there will try to help you submit your file and figure out what the problem is.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question for Jennifer Hyland, and here is the question. For packaging such as one tube and one carton, with both package levels be reported?
When the package types are 1-to-1, then it should be reported as a single level package, and just the outermost package should be reported. Thanks.
Thanks for responding to those questions. Moving back up to the beginning of our panel, we have more questions for Jennifer Forde, and here is the first question. Are vitamins and supplements required to be reported?
Thank you for that question. So obligations under Section 510J3 of the Act pertain to listed drugs. So if the product is regulated as a drug and it's listed and commercially manufactured for commercial distribution, then yes, it will need to be reported. But if it's not a drug product, then it's not subject to the drug amount reporting program. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have a few more questions for Jennifer Forde, and here is the next question. Will this guidance be made mandatory, or is it still optional to provide this reporting?
Thank you for this question. The draft guidance document is not a binding document. And with respect to some of the associated timing questions, the recommended reporting dates, including the February 15th, 2022 and May 16th, 2022 dates for reporting the 2020 and 2021 data, respectively, are not required deadlines for submitting such data. However, registrants are still required under Section 510J3 of the Act to report annually regarding the amount of listed drugs that are manufactured, prepared, propagated, compounded, or processed for commercial distribution. Registrants that have yet to submit their data are encouraged to do so. And if there are questions regarding the content for your drug amount report, please feel free to reach out to the drug amount reporting email address. That there's a team there that is really very helpful and can help you to figure out if you have questions regarding the content to be included in your report. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question for Jennifer Forde, and here is the question. Does this regulation apply to listed veterinary drugs?
Thank you again for this question. Lots of questions about the scope of products. So obligations under Section 510J3 of the Act pertain to listed drugs. It's not specific to. It doesn't. Doesn't only apply to human drugs. So yes, veterinary drugs, animal drugs are included in the reporting requirement. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist. The next group of questions will be for Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary. And here is the first question for Leyla. It was stated that APIs need to be listed with the FDA. Does this also mean that an NDC is required for APIs?
Yes, APIs that fall under Section 510 of the Act, meaning they are obviously drugs. If they are also in commercial distribution, they are required to be listed with FDA, and any drug listing requires submission and inclusion of an NDC. unique to that drug product.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have a few more questions for Leyla. And here's the next question. One second, I'm waiting on my document to repopulate. Ah, there we are. Here's the question. What are the drug listing and reporting requirements for a contract manufacturing clinical phase 1, 2, and 3 drugs for different clients?
So manufacturers of clinical trial products, whether if it's phase 1, 2, or 3, under 207 fall under the exemptions, 207.13, and they are exempt from registration and listing requirements under the research clause.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a couple more questions for Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary. And here's the next question. Is a PLD required to list?
A PLD that does not register with FDA because they don't perform any drug manufacturing activity is not required to list any drugs with us. However, it is important to understand that the PLD's drug is required to be listed. Under the regulations, this responsibility and obligation falls on the manufacturer of the product. So if a PLD is working with contract manufacturer to manufacture the product for them under their own name and label, then the contract manufacturer is responsible also to list the product it manufactures for the PLD. Therefore, there are 2 drug listings here, one for the contract manufacturer under contract manufacturer's labeler code, and one for the PLD under PLD's labeler code. You also have to remember that the PLD can act as an authorized agent for its own drug listing, and so therefore it can assume responsibility for drug listing and therefore reporting requirements.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Leyla, and here is the question. Are we required to list excipients?
So under 207, 21 CFR Part 207, that is the codified that extensively talks about registration and listing requirements. Excipients are, again, under the exemptions under 207.13.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question that just came in for Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary, and here is the question. Are we required to list homeopathic drugs?
Yes, all drugs are required to be listed. Any drug, unless exempted, that is required to be listed need to be also reported. Homeopathics are required to be listed with FDA, and unless exempted, they should be reported. I'm not very familiar with the exemptions under the reporting requirements.
Thank you for responding to that group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we have a few questions that came in from Matthew Rosenberg, and here's the first question. What types of expertise is FDA able to bring to bear on analyzing and interpreting the data to ensure that the agency is using them appropriately and drawing the right conclusions from them?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So here at FDA, we have many data scientists in-house who have helped us to establish other programs that use large-scale data analysis. For instance, our resource capacity planning program within CDER. So these are folks that have a lot of expertise already using our own data, our internal data, and have worked with data sets on drug supply chains in the past. And I'd say we also have a wealth of people with experience on the drug manufacturing or drug supply chain side. Some folks have, been kind of here as well as in industry. So, I think we have people that really understand some of the challenges in understanding and interpreting these data. So that's something we're hoping to bring to bear on this, to really bring multiple perspectives to analyzing and interpreting what we receive from all of you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have a few more questions from Matthew, and here is the next question. Why does FDA think drug amount reporting is helpful for measuring drug supply chain vulnerabilities and potentially predicting supply chain issues?
Yeah, so when we worked on our drug shortage report several years ago, and I'm sure many of you have seen that as well, we found that 62% of the drug shortages that began between 2013 and 2017 were related to manufacturing issues. And even though, of course, the COVID pandemic has drawn some additional attention to these demand-driven drug shortages, where products that have been used in hospitals, for instance, have seen spikes in demand, we still think that the supply chain challenges and vulnerabilities are really an important risk factor for these kinds of outcomes. So through the data like we saw in the presentation, we're hoping to really understand the dependence of the supply chain on specific establishments, and we believe this will help us get a better sense of whether certain establishments, if they're experiencing challenges or other issues, could contribute downstream to these other sorts of problems.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have one more question from Matthew in this round, and here's the question. How does reporting more granular data, such as at the monthly level, help FDA accomplish the efforts that you described in the presentation?
Yeah, thanks. And I know we've received some questions about this in the past. The monthly data are helpful for us because they help us get a sense of the seasonality in drug production, and that'll help us get a better feel for whether certain types of supply chain issues, or even as we were talking about with predicting, trying to look back at some of the ones that have occurred in the past, if they're more likely to manifest at certain times of the year. So that could be helpful for predictive modeling. It can really help to point out whether certain products are tending to have issues at certain times. And also just for thinking about these kinds of emergencies, natural disasters, and other response situations, understanding if there are different patterns of production at certain times of the year can get us a better sense of whether not just if products tend to be made at certain facilities, but if they tend to be there at the times when those incidents are occurring.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our last panelist, Jennifer Hyland, we have a few questions that came in, and here's the first question. If an authorized agent submits a report on a registrant's behalf, is the registrant also required to submit a report separately?
Hi, thank you for that question. No, each NDC should be reported only once. So once the first report is submitted, then the requirement is met for that NDC.
Thank you for responding to that question. We've got a few more questions that came in for Jennifer Hyland, and here's the next question. Can a PLD report drug amounts if they collect all the data from the manufacturer and the CMO?
Yes, the primary responsibility for reporting lies with the manufacturer, but they may authorize an agent to report data on their behalf, and that includes the PLD. And I'd like to point out that they do not need to wait and collect all of the data all at once. They can submit data in batches as they receive it from the manufacturer. So they can submit CSV files, at different times or even on different days as they collect the data and prepare it. Thanks.
Thank you for responding to that question. We have one more question for Jennifer Hyland, and here's the question. Who should report if the inner package is manufactured by a foreign manufacturer and the outer packaging is performed in the U.S.?
Okay, remember that there are 6 business operations that are included in reporting. The first type of packaging should be reported by the manufacturer, and then the repackager should also report under their NDC and DUNS. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to those questions. Moving back to the beginning of our Q&A panel, we have a few more questions that came in for Jennifer Forde, and here is the first question. What is the difference between this amount reported and that reported in the application's annual reports other than the reporter?
Thank you for that question. So for human drugs, we acknowledge that applicants with approved applications provide to FDA certain distribution data in their annual reports. However, the data is aggregated and tends to reflect the total amount distributed by an applicant. It does not include reporting specific to each establishment of the listed drug. So if an application includes multiple establishments, the information reported in the annual report that's submitted, for instance, under 314.81 and 600.81 of our regulations, wouldn't be specific to each establishment. So that can introduce some challenges for the agency in accessing information that could be used to make drug facility surveillance decisions, as well as some of our work around drug shortages. So in contrast with that, reports submitted under the CARES Act, under our drug amount reporting program, those reports should be submitted for each establishment. In addition, reports that we receive that are the annual reports under 314.81 and 600.81 are limited to the finished drug product. They don't include information about API, drug substance, or unfinished product. Additionally, the annual reports arrive from numerous applicants at different times throughout the year. So this can make it challenging for the agency to compare data received from different approved applications. And of course, as previously noted, the annual reporting requirement, again, referencing 314.81 and 600.81, goes to application approved products only. It wouldn't cover things such as OTC monograph drugs. The data that we receive under the Drug Amount Reporting Program, the CARES Act, the data should arrive to the agency at about the same time frame, using the recommendations in the draft guidance, which would provide us with a more comprehensive picture of the drug supply chain during a specific time period. So those are some of the differences between what we receive in the annual reports versus the drug amount reports. Thank you.
Thank you for responding to that question. We do have another question for Jennifer Forde. And here's the question. Do we need to report 2020 and 2021 if we never reported?
Yeah, so as some background on that, the requirement stems from the CARES Act, which requires annual reporting on the amount of listed drug by registrants. And this law was enacted in 2020. The draft guidance document itself is not a binding document. So the dates in there that recommend when reports should be submitted are not requirements. But registrants are still required to submit annual reports to the agency regarding the amount of listed drugs that are manufactured, prepared, propagated, compounded, or processed for commercial distribution. If you haven't yet submitted your data, you are encouraged to do so. Again, there's drug amount reporting at fda.hhs.gov. The team there is willing to assist if you have questions regarding the content that you want to include in your report. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for responding to the group of questions. Moving on to our next panelist, we do have another question that came in for Leyla Rahjou-Esfandiary, and here is the question. Are we required to list a prescription drug that is not the subject of an approved application?
Yes, drug listing requirements apply to any drug in U.S. commercial distribution, regardless of its approval status.
Thank you for responding to that question. Moving on to our next panelist, Matthew Rosenberg. We did get another question for Matt, and here is the question. How does historical reporting data from prior years, such as from 2020 or 2021, help FDA predict future drug shortages?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And we did discuss this, I think, a little bit in the presentation and also in an earlier question. I think the historical data for us, the value really is in understanding how the events that are occurring in the past, drug shortages that have occurred previously, connect in with shifts in supply chain, shift in market characteristics, and other potential risk factors for supply chain issues and drug shortages. So something to consider as we think about the value of the historical data is that the number of drug shortages that typically occur in a given point in time, let's say, that are posted on our website right now, it's about 100 products, I would say, that are on our website. So when you think of how many drugs are in the marketplace, it can take some time to build up examples of enough drug shortages to build these kinds of models. So that's a reason why the historical data are really valuable for us. They help us get enough examples, enough patterns to really start to fit and validate predictive models.
Thank you for responding to that question. Looks like we're just about out of time. We're going to try to squeeze in one more question, and we just had a question come in for Jennifer Highland, and here is the question. How should an establishment that manufactures from API to FDF report amounts?
They should report under the NDCs of the product leaving the establishment. If an establishment manufactures API and uses all of that API for finished products, then amounts should be reported only under the NDC of the finished product. If some of the API is packaged and sent to another manufacturer, then amounts of that released API should be reported under the NDC of the API, and the amounts of the finished product should be reported under its own NDC. Reporting should be guided by the NDCs that the registrant holds. Thank you.
That's all the time we have for questions during this panel discussion. Thanks to all of our presenters for answering numerous questions that came in. We'll now transition into our break and resume our next session at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Enjoy your break.